Our topic is Purim, so we're going to talk about Purim over the phone. Hello to whoever is there. Purim by the Rebbe was a very, very big deal, as you all could imagine. There were Farbrengens every single year from the year the Rebbe became Rebbe, which is Tafshin Yud Aleph, 1951, until Tafshin Mem Zayin, 1987. In Tafshin Mem Ches, the Rebbetzin had just passed away. The Rebbe was actually in Shloishim for the Rebbetzin, so the Rebbe was not even in 770. The Rebbe stayed home that Purim. And he spoke Sichos, a whole bunch of Sichos. He spoke Tainus Esther in the afternoon. He spoke after the Megillah at night, I think. He spoke after Mincha and he spoke after Ma'ariv, but there were no longer any Purim Farbrengens. Purim Farbrengens by the Rebbe were always very, very special. And I want to start with the following. We're starting a conversation about Purim. I want to start with the following idea. There was a certain pattern to the Rebbe's Purim Farbrengenishen that I think is very, very important to appreciate and to underscore. And that is that the Rebbe's Purim Farbrengenishen all revolved around the message of the Purim story. And if you had to summarize the message of the Purim story in one sentence, the sentence would be, the Yidden are different than Goyim. That's the whole story of Purim. If you distill, if you summarize the Purim story in a sentence, that's what you get. That when a Yid acts like a Goy, he pays for it. He suffers for it. He can even lose his life. When a Yid recognizes that he's different than a Goy and he's supposed to behave differently than a Goy, then all kinds of miracles occur and it turns out to be an incredible bracha. That's in essence, in one sentence, the whole story of Purim. When Yidden acted like Goyim, by going to the Suda of Achashverosh and all the other things, they were at risk of losing their lives. When one Yid took a stand of lo yichra lo yishtachve, he changed the entire situation and he brought the Jewish people an incredible salvation. That's in essence the Purim story. So every year on Purim, when the Rebbe used to farbreng, of course using 101 different forms, the Rebbe would make this point, that if you really wanted to appreciate what Purim is, if you wanted to understand what a Yid is supposed to take from Purim, the message that Yid is to take from Purim, that a Yid is different than a Goy. How is a Yid different than a Goy? A Yid is different than a Goy in the following way. A Goy lives his life according to the limitations of Teva. And he lives his life within the parameters of the world in which he lives. Which means that a Goy is supposed to conform. When the society or the world in which he lives it considers a certain thing normal or considers a certain thing upstanding or acceptable, that's how the Goy is supposed to live. A Yid has a very different idea. A Yid is connected to the Eibishter. And the Metzias of a Yid is not a Tivias de Metzias, it's not a natural Metzias, it's a Nes Metzias, it's a supernatural Metzias. And a Yid survives and thrives only when he insists on being different rather than trying to be like the Goy. I'm sure you know the story. This is one of those great little episodes, and I actually think it's true. The story happened with one of the Twersky brothers. There's a family Twersky whose their father was a Guterid, was what they call in some cultures a Rebbe, and his children grew up in America in the 1920s and the 1930s, and each one of them is a professional in a particular field. One is a lawyer, and one is a psychiatrist. They're very, very famous in a variety of different fields, and they've also done a lot of tovos for a lot of Yidden. But they're Chassidish Yidden at the same time. In other words, their involvement in the world hasn't compromised them. Anyway, so the story is that one of these Twersky guys was sitting on a train or a bus with his payas and his beard and his beaver hat and his long kapota, and some woman gets on the bus or the train and starts lecturing him about the fact that he's embarrassing the Jewish people and that if it were not for him, the Jewish people would be better off, because when Jewish people insist on being different and showing their Jewishness to the whole world, they create all kinds of hate from Goyim to Yidden. So he says to this woman, I don't understand what you're saying. I don't speak the language you're speaking. She was talking to him in Yiddish. He says to her, I'm Amish. I come from Pennsylvania, and this is how we live, where I live. So of course she pauses and she says how much she loves the fact that the Amish are holding on to their tradition, they're holding on to their culture, and they're not changing, they're not adapting for other people. And after she explains to him how much she thinks the Amish culture is wonderful, he says to her in a perfect Yiddish, as a Yid zetoy that's a problem. When a Jew looks different than a Goy, it's a problem. But when a Goy looks different than another Goy, that's perfectly fine. This is really, the Rebbe's Purim revolved around this point. That's how the Rebbe celebrated Purim and stood in Purim. The whole Nakuda, the whole point, the whole essence of it was, that the Purim story shows us that a Yid is different than a Goy. Yishtachveh. And only when a Yid acts as a Jew do the miracles start happening, do the good things happen to a Yid. And when a Yid tries to assimilate Rahman, all kinds of terrible things may happen. In other words, when a Yid tries to be like the Goy, he never succeeds. So let me give you examples for this, okay? And I guess I'm using this Purim Fabrengen, this Purim class, for a purpose which is broad, if you will, not directly connected to Purim. There's a movement in the Jewish world which is dying now that's called the Reform Movement. The Reform Movement started in Germany. And the Reform Movement had one purpose. The Reform Movement had one goal. The Reform Movement, which started about 300 years ago, had as its goal to curb anti-Semitism. There was an idea amongst German Jews that said that the reason Goyim hate Yidden so much is because Yidden insist on being different. Yeshnu. And that if Yidden would be more like Goyim, then Goyim would hate them less. And the Reform Movement, of course, had a slogan. Their slogan was, Tehi Yehudi b'veisecha v'adam b'tzeisecha. In your home, be as Jewish as you want. When you walk out into the street, be German. Look exactly like a Goy. To make a long story short, what the Reform Movement and their fear of anti-Semitism gave us, in other words, the idea that the Reform had, that the only way to survive as a Jew in Golus is to be as similar to the Goy as possible, were the Nazis. The same Germany that gave us the Reform Movement also gave us Hitler. And of course, when Hitler sent Jewish people into the gas chambers, he didn't separate what the German Jews used to call the Wust Yud from the Ust Yud, the Eastern Jew from the Western Jew, the Yid who wore Streimel and Payas from the Jew who considered himself first German and then a Jew. And it was established beyond any shadow of a doubt that when a Yid tries to act like a Goy, it doesn't help him. It doesn't make the Goy accept him anymore. The Purim story teaches that on the very essence level, a Yid is different than a Goy. And no matter what a Yid is going to do, the Goy is not going to like him. Because the hate from a Goy to a Yid is not because a Yid is different. The hate from a Goy to a Yid is because a Yid is a Yid. So this is my first example. The Reform Movement is a modern day example of the Nehenu Mis'udase Shal Eisei Rasha, Yidden partaking of the feast of Achashverosh. In other words, Yidden thinking that the best way to successfully survive Golus is by trying to assimilate. And that ended in disaster. Now, fast forward 200 years, and there have been other efforts of Jewish people trying to be like the Goy, again based on the same principle. The principle was that Jewish people have to do things in order to curb anti-Semitism. But in this case, it was very, very different. And I'm referring to the modern Zionist movement. I don't know if you understand what Zionism is. Of course, today Zionism is synonymous with Eretz Yisrael and so on. But the Zionist movement was the same idea that about 130 years ago, Yidden discovered finally that anti-Semitism was not going to go away if Yidden acted like Goyim. They finally realized that when a Yid acts like a Goy, It does not make the goy hate him less. To the contrary, anti-Semitism remains exactly the same. And of course, that's the story that happened with Dreyfus. He was a colonel in the French army, and he was as French as any other Frenchman, but he happened to be Jewish, and there was some kind of a problem, and they made him into a sacrificial lamb. And Jewish people realized that trying to make anti-Semitism go away by trying to be as goyish as a goy failed as an idea. So they came up with a new idea. What was the new idea? Modern Zionism. And again, I don't know how much you understand about modern Zionism, but in essence, what modern Zionism is another effort as a Yid being like a goy. But in this case, it's very, very different. In the Reform movement, a Yid being like a goy consisted of assimilating with the goy. In other words, whatever the goy is, the Yid is, trying to be exactly like the goy. Zionism had a very different idea. The idea of Zionism was what they called nationalism. Nationalism means that the Jewish people would be a separate nation from all the nations in the world. In other words, instead of Yidden saying that the best way to to preserve ourselves is by trying to be exactly like the Goy, the Yid would create his own identity, a nationalistic identity. But the Zionist idea and the nationalistic idea that the Zionists represented was basically the same thing as the Reform movement, just wearing a different shirt. How is it the same? It's the same because, as the Rebbe would say so often on the Farbrengens, Kechol ha'amim beis Yisrael, that the Jewish people are a nation like all other nations. All nations have a national identity, have a nationhood identity, and the Jewish people also have a national identity, an identity based on their own nature. So now Yidden decided that instead of Yidden being exactly like Goyim, Yidden would be them different than Goyim, but not different than Goyim, that are the nation of God, different than Goyim, that just like every other Goy has a nation and has a land and has a language and has a culture and has all these other worldly things, the Jewish people would do the same thing. So even though, as a practical matter, the Zionist idea and the Reform idea are very opposite, because the Reform idea was Jewish people trying to be the same as the Goy they live amongst. And the Zionist idea was the Jew trying to be different than the Goy he live amongst. They're basically exactly the same thing. Because in the end, here was a series of Jewish people who, on some level of sincerity at least, were trying to prevent anti-Semitism, but every effort that they made to offset, to fight anti-Semitism was based on the idea of a Yid being like a Goy. Whether Yid being like a Goy means exactly like a Goy, or a Yid being like a Goy means having his own identity, but it'll be a nationalistic identity, it failed. It didn't work. That's the fact of life. The fact of the matter is that none of these efforts worked. Okay, and of course, the example for this that we all know is the story of Shaul HaMelech. Right? What's the story of Shaul HaMelech? The story of Shaul HaMelech was that there was a man named Shmuel. Shmuel, it says in Chazal, was equal in greatness to Moshe and Aaron. As steht in Chazal, Shmuel was as great as Moshe and Aaron combined. And the Jewish people had lived for hundreds of years as tribes. In other words, the Jewish people, every Shevet lived its own existence. Reuven lived its own existence. Naphtali lived its own existence. Yehuda lived its own existence. God lived its own existence. And one nation did not know what was going on with another nation. And Shmuel HaNavi went around and invited Yidden to come to Shiloh and to develop a Jewish identity as a nation. The Jewish people, rather than be individual tribes, should become a nation. And Shmuel HaNavi traveled. I don't know if you're familiar with the Tanakh. Shmuel HaNavi had this shita that he wouldn't take anything from anybody. So as he journeyed, he took along with himself food and drink and a tent. So we should not need anybody's assistance in any way, shape, or form, and he encouraged Yidden to come to Shiloh. What was the end of the story? Shmuel successfully invited all the Jewish people to come to Shiloh, and as soon as the Jewish people came to Shiloh, they came to Shmuel HaNavi and asked for a melech. They asked for a king. And of course, all of us know that the Jewish people having a king is a mitzvah sasei de'eraisa. It's a mitzvah in the Torah of same Tosam Melech HaMelech. So there can't possibly be a crime in the Jewish people asking for a king. So the Tanakh tells us that when the Jewish people asked for a king, Shmuel HaNavi was very, very, very upset. He was visibly upset. He was very, very upset. And whether he told the Eibishter or he didn't tell the Eibishter, obviously the Eibishter knew that Shmuel was very upset. Shmuel was very, very upset that the Yidden wanted a melech. So the Eibishter says to Shmuel HaNavi, Lo ya'oscha ma'asu ki im oisi. He was trying to make Shmuel feel better. So he said to Shmuel, don't think that the Jewish people are upset with, are trying to distance themselves and separate themselves from you. They're trying to separate themselves from me. In other words, the Eibishter said to Shmuel HaNavi that the issue that the Jewish people have is not with Shmuel, it's with the Eibishter himself. Now, of course, the question becomes, all the Jewish people wanted was a king. Having a king is a mitzvah in the Torah. So what did the Eibishter mean when the Eibishter says to Shmuel HaNavi, Lo ya'oscha ma'asu ki im eisi? And the answer, in short, is because the Jewish people wanted taka melech. But they didn't want a melech because there's a mitzvah in the Torah to have a melech. They wanted a melech because, as the Rebbe used to say the Lashon very, very often, Kechol ha'amim beis Yisrael, that the Jewish people would be like all other nations. And this is the pshat in the psukim. The Yidden want to have a melech, but the reason they want to have a melech is not because the Eibishter says in his Torah he's supposed to have a melech. Because if the Yidden wanted a melech, as the Eibishter says in Torah that he wants a melech, they would have waited for the Navi to bring them that melech. Or to say it differently, they wouldn't have waited 400 years to ask the Eibishter for the melech. The fact that for hundreds of years Jewish people didn't care about a king. They lived tribal existences, everyone was in his own little world. And all of a sudden, the Navi brings them together, and as soon as the Navi brings them together, all of a sudden, they want to have a melech. And of course the answer is because the Jewish people's desire for a king was not to fulfill a mitzvah. The Jewish people's desire for a king was that they shouldn't have the Navi and what the Navi represents breathing down their back. So going back to the beginning of our history, we have this, if you will, this disease, this idea that the Yidden try to be like Goyim. You have it in the Tanakh, you have it in the story of Purim, and you also have it in modern times. Like I said before, if you want two modern day examples of Yidden trying to be like Goyim, you have two opposite examples. The first example is the Reform movement, where Yidden wanted to be like Goyim, meaning to be exactly like them. The second example is the Zionist movement, where the Jewish people wanted to have a nationalistic self-identity. But in both cases, the essence of the story is exactly the same. The Jewish people wanted to be like everybody else. And the Rebbe would always use the Purim story as his framework, and he would say, we all know what happened on Purim. That when Yidden try to be like the Goy, it brings to them the inyan of Hepech HaChaim. And when a Yid recognizes that a Yid is different than a Goy, then he brings to himself incredible bracha v'atzlacha. Like the story of Purim. Right? What's the story of Purim? The story of Purim is that the Yidden found themselves in a terrible Maimed Matziv, and this terrible Maimed Matziv was offset, not, basically the Rebbe always brings in the Siches, that Mordechai was not a Batlan. Mordechai was not some kind of a loser. Mordechai was not, as the Rebbe puts it in the Sikha, a shamish in a shul or a melamed tinekis. Mordechai was not a person who was not well connected. Mordechai was a person who was incredibly well connected. Mordechai had connections on the highest levels of government. And yet, when Mordechai found himself in a situation with Yidden lives were in sakana, how did Mordechai address that difficulty? Mordechai addressed that difficulty by doing tshuva, by calling Yidden to tshuva, by making Yidden more Jewish. In other words, rather than try to defeat the difficulties that the Jewish people were having using political connections and worldly means, Mordechai tried to offset the tzaras that the Jewish people had by bringing them to tshuva. Why? Because Mordechai understood this basic message. And this basic message really brings out what is the essence of the story of Purim. The essence of the story of Purim is that Yidden are different than Goyim. Yidden are different than Goyim. And the difference between a Yid and a Goy consists of the fact that we're the nation of God. And when we live as the Eibishter wants us to live, in the spirit of God and the shadow of God and so forth and so on, we see unbelievable bracha. But when a Yid tries to succeed in the world by being like the Goy, it never works. It doesn't work. And like I said to you in the beginning of this conversation, this is one of the basic themes of so many of the Rebbe's Purim Jewish. This was the point that the Rebbe always used to bring out, that Purim teaches us that a Yid is different than everybody else. And of course, to apply that to a Hasidic context, if you will, the whole definition of being a Chassid is really not caring what the world says. The Rebbe used to say often that a Chassid, in quotes, Dafnesh Arab Baisen Yenim Denoz. There's no requirement, Dafke, to do things to aggravate people, to upset people, to insult people, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, a Yid has to know that his identity is a Yiddish identity, and a Yid is very, very different than a Goy. We live in a world where, forgive me for putting it in these words, but this is the truth, Jews and Gentiles have never been closer. You would have to go back hundreds of years, maybe to the time of the golden age of Spain, maybe even earlier, to find a time when Yidden lived amongst Goyim in such a way where they were, at least in their own minds, so accepted by the Goy that you almost don't see the difference between a Yid and a Goy. So the Rebbe says this is the test. This is the test of our time. The test of our time, and of course there's many, many examples for it, and one of them would be the modern state of Israel and the way they deal with Goyim and Goyishkeit. I'll get back to that in a minute. But let's first talk about us. The Rebbe says a Yid has to know that he's different than a Goy. And a Yid has to know that if he wants to succeed, it's his difference from the Goy that makes him successful. In other words, young people grow up. When you're a little kid, you do whatever your parents said. When you're an old man or an old woman, you sort of figure stuff out one way or another. But when you're in the stage in your life where you're old enough to have your own opinions and your own judgment, but you're still too young to have had many life's experiences, if you will, you sometimes make the mistake of looking at the world and finding it attractive. And you know what? The world is taka very attractive. And there's a lot about the world that, if you will, draws us in. But a Yid has to know that he can never possibly be a part of the world. As hard as a Yid is going to try, the world won't let him. That's the Purim story. The Purim story is that the world will not let a Yid be like a Goy. And when a Yid tries to be like a Goy, it backfires. It doesn't work. And therefore, when you talk to a girl who's, whatever age you girls are, 18, 19, 20, whatever age you are, and you're young and you're figuring stuff out and you're learning about the world and you're learning about being a Jew, so the Rebbe says that it's very, very important for a Yid to understand what a Yid is. A Yid will never succeed by trying to be like the Goy. In other words, in America today, there is a worldly paradigm. There is a way you're supposed to behave, and so on and so forth. And this mode of behavior for a Goy is perfectly legitimate and perfectly normal and perfectly acceptable. And it has to do with all aspects. It has to do with the way a person dresses, has to do with the way a person talks, it has to do with how a person thinks about what's important in life. But for a Yid, these things don't work. For a Yid, these things don't work. It's not because we're not trying hard enough, it's because a Yid is basically different than a Goy. A Yid is basically different than a Goy. A Yid cannot do as the Goy does and have the same kind of success as a Goy. The Goy simply will not allow him to do it. There's a great illustration for this. The Rebbe met Shimon Peres many, many years ago. And Shimon Peres, in general, and particularly at the time he met the Rebbe, was quite secular. He wasn't really interested in what the Rebbe had to say and the Rebbe's philosophy and so on. He was most impressed by the Rebbe's understanding of geopolitics and the events in Israel. He wasn't so impressed by the ideas that the Rebbe shared with him, but he still repeated them a lot, and you have them on Living Torah and so on and so forth. And the Rebbe, in a conversation that he had with him, his first conversation, asked him what he thought was the reason for Jewish survival. Was Jewish survival due to anti-Semitism, or was Jewish survival due to Jewish identity? In other words, the fact that the Jewish people had something that was so real and so special that allowed them and helped them to survive. And after the Rebbe asked the question, the Rebbe told him, the language the Rebbe used was Hein Om Levadod Yishkein. And the Rebbe asked him how was it that the Jewish people were so alone and how they survived and succeeded and so on. Bottom line is the Rebbe's answer was that it's a combination of two factors. It's a combination of the anti-Semitism and it's a combination of Jewish identity. So here gets the point. Today, the isolation of Jewish people because of anti-Semitism is to a very, very great extent no longer a true factor. So Jewish identity becomes much, much more subjective. It becomes much, much harder to identify and to hold on to when you don't have an enemy that hates you and unifies you in that way. And as I mentioned, and I'm going to explain this later, what you're seeing happening in Israel and this whole new age of anti-Semitism makes this point, that Yidden are different. So what the Rebbe was saying to Shimon Peres is that in an age where you don't feel anti-Semitism so acutely, the tendency towards thinking that Yidden are exactly like Goyim is stronger, and it's just not true. And this is really our test. Our test is that if you were taking away the anti-Semitism component, could Jewish people still have a strong Jewish identity? It's a serious question and it's an important question. And we must answer the question correctly. And ultimately, if we don't, tragically, the Goy will help us answer the question, which is much more painful than if we identify ourselves for what we are as Jewish people without the help of anti-Semitism and the Goy. So, B'meila, Yid has two breides. One breide that a Yid has is to be embarrassed by his identity and to try and get away from it. And unfortunately, there are many millions of Jews who do this. Many millions of Jews who are not from who do this. And there are also many from Yidden who do this. But the Rebbe says in the end it never works. Now the other approach is the Rebbe's approach to learn from Mordechai HaYehudi. That the story of Mordechai HaYehudi was that יכרע ישתחווה. Mordechai HaYehudi succeeded where everybody else failed because he didn't try to get the Goy to like him by being like the Goy. He got the Goy to respect him by being very, very different than the Goy. And this is an important lesson for young adults to hear and understand and internalize, that we will never succeed at being like a Goy. The Goy will simply not let us. And again, it's not because we're doing anything wrong. It's simply because we're different creatures. We're a very, very different creature than a Goy. And because we're very different creature than a Goy, what works for a Goy simply does not work for a Yid. It's very, very simple. Now, as I started to say, let me give you an example from modern day Eretz Yisrael. Modern day Eretz Yisrael was built on the principle, like I said to you before, of nationalism. Nationalism means that a Yid is going to create his own nation, but even though he's going to create his own nation, he's going to create his own nation in the model of other nations. That we should be similar to, but different than the Goy. And of course, when you live in this kind of a world, you have to make the Goy like you. which means it's very, very important to you what the United Nations thinks. It's very, very important to you what America thinks. It's very, very important to you what college professors think. It's very important to you what the Europeans think, and so forth and so on. So where are we right now? Let's take a look at the Maimed Matzah of Yidden today, and let's talk about it. Israel became a state and tried very, very hard to make Goyim like them. And then there were a series of wars. I don't want to bore you. I don't want to get into too many details. Right? There was a 6-day war. And right after the 6-day war, the Rebbe said that Israel has to take all the lands that the Eibishter liberated for them miraculously in the 6-day war and make them Israel. And the Rebbe said, when the Eibishter makes such an overt ness, that the Jewish people win the land in the incredibly miraculous way that they won it, that a Jewish person cannot turn his back on the miracles of the Eibishter and give it away. Now the fact was that before that 6-day war was over, the whole 6-day war lasted 6 days. Before that 6-day war was over, the Jewish people were already talking about giving back the lands that they liberated in that war. And again, I don't know if you know a lot of the history, but much of the history is that they were disappointed that the soldiers took the Kesel HaMaravi and so on and so forth. They didn't want any part of these things. The secular Israelis had no use for the Kesel HaMaravi and things like this. And the soldiers on their own, whatever the particulars were, went ahead and liberated the Kesel, and now the so-called secular Israelis had to deal with it. One of the classes that I do with you seminary girls is the class on Shleimus Ha'aretz. And in the class of Shleimus Ha'aretz, one of the ideas that we talk about is President Shazar. President Shazar was a Lubavitcher Chassid from home. He was also very, very close to the Rebbe. And he was one of the most important leaders in Israel. After the 6-day war, when the Rebbe started talking about the Yidden holding on to the territories and so forth and so on, he wrote the Rebbe a letter. And in the letter, he writes, amongst other things, this is a direct quote, he writes, Einoi maniach oisi lihiyos Chabadi. Zalman Shazar wrote to the Rebbe, you, meaning the Rebbe, are not allowing me to be a Lubavitcher Chassid. Because the Rebbe was putting enormous pressure on Eretz Yisrael that they should annex the lands that they liberated rather than give it back. And the Israeli politicians wouldn't even think of it. Now, the reason the Israeli politicians wouldn't think of it is very, very simple. Because the world wouldn't like it. The Goy wouldn't like it. And of course, the Rebbe made the point that I've been making until now, that when a Yid tries to win the favor of a Goy on Goyish terms, the only thing that happens is that the Goy ends up hating him. Because there is no way a Yid can be loved by a Goy when he imitates a Goy. The only way a Yid can be respected by a Goy if he acts the way he's supposed to. And of course, the modern state of Israel, which is run by, unfortunately, not from a Yidden, and from in this case, I don't only mean keeping Shabbos and keeping kosher. I mean having, like Mordechai had, a sense of la yichna v'la yishtachve. La yichna v'la yishtachve means that a Yid is different than a Goy. So look at the situation. The situation in plain words is, the harder Yidden try to make Goyim like them, the more they hate us. If you look at the world today, especially when you look at Europe, you see such an incredible amount of anti-Semitism. And the root of this anti-Semitism is that we're not good enough. When a Yid tries to be like a Goy, the Goy never ever accepts it. Why? Because the Goy knows that a Yid is different, right? What do you have? What do you have in Israel today? You have Israel surrounded by neighbors that want to destroy them. Israel practicing unbelievable restraint in how they defend themselves. In other words, the number of Arabs that were killed by Israel because of all of the terrorism pales in comparison comparison to the number of Arabs killed by other Arabs in Syria and in Egypt and all the other places. And yet, the Syrian Arab, the Egyptian Arab, the Iraqi Arab, even the Iranian Arab, or whatever he is, Muslim, is forgiven for committing those crimes. And a Yid is considered the worst person in the world because an Arab child tried to kill him and he killed the Arab child, or an Arab adult tried to kill him and he killed the Arab adult, or whatever the case is. And of course the answer is because a Goy doesn't look at a Yid like he looks at another Goy. A Goy looks at a Yid in a very different way, and you can explain it in a lot of ways. And one of the ways you could explain it is that the Goy expects more from a Yid. And because the Goy expects more from a Yid, or to say it even differently, the Goy sees the Yid as the person who sets the trend. And if a Yid's attitude is that when someone punches you in the nose, you ask him not to punch you, so the Goy doesn't understand why the Yid punches back, why the Yid tries to defend himself. In other words, when a Yid tries to succeed by being like a Goy, the Goy doesn't let him. The Goy doesn't let him. And this is the situation we find ourselves in Eretz Yisrael. When Yidden stop being proud, and when they think of themselves like any nation, besides for themselves, the one who doesn't let them get away with it is the Goy himself. And this is why there's so much hatred towards Eretz Yisrael, and it doesn't matter how hard Eretz Yisrael tries to make a Goy like him, there is no way that a Goy will accept a Yid trying to be like a Goy. He could never do it good enough. And the Rebbe says this is the message of Purim. The message of Purim is that a Yid has to stop trying to imitate the Goy. A Yid has to be proud to be a Jew, be different. And the fact of the matter is that when a Yid is different, that's when the Goy respects him. That's when the Goy appreciates him. That's when the Goy honors him. In other words, only when a Yid says, I belong to the Eibishter, and the rules that govern my life are different than the rules that govern everybody else's life, and that the choices that I make are based on what's written in the Torah. Or let's use the modern day Oisius. Eretz Yisrael exists only because of a nes of the Eibishter. And a Yid, instead of hiding the fact that Eretz Yisrael is a nes from the Eibishter, because it doesn't sound goyish, it doesn't sound modern, it doesn't sound like the United Nations is going to approve. But when a Yid says to the Goy, we're really different. Our existence is based on miracles. And the Eibush has performed the miracle, given us Eretz Yisrael, and we're not about to give it away. This is where the Yid gains respect from the Goy. And this, if you think about it, has been the struggle that the Rebbe has been fighting now for close to 50 years. I'll put it to you in different words. When I was a little boy, I used to go to Fabrengens like everybody else. And I would listen to the Rebbe scream about Shleimus Ha'aretz. I would listen to the Rebbe get really, really, really upset about the fact that Israel was thinking that they're going to trade land for peace. Or, as the Rebbe used to say it cynically, give away land, which is vital for their security and their safety, in the Rebbe's words, for a papiro, for a piece of paper, for an empty and useless piece of paper. And I remember saying to my father, what is the point of the Rebbe talking about all these things? Why was the Rebbe spending so much time and so much effort talking to Israel about how they should behave if the Israelis were not listening? So my father used to tell me that the Rebbe is teaching them. And the Rebbe is not just teaching them, the Rebbe is teaching all of us. And the lesson that the Rebbe is teaching is this very, very lesson. That Yidden are different than Goyim. And a Yid can never succeed if he tries to be like a Goy. In other words, the Rebbe understands that this is a very, very important and powerful lesson to learn. The Rebbe understands that to get the Yidden in the modern world, and as I said before, the meaning of the modern world is that Yidden have never been closer to Goyim. Today a Yid can do business with a Goy. Today a Yid can go lahavdil to the same schools as a Goy, can have any vocation, any profession he wants. The world seems to be, pardon me, in a much better place as far as anti-Semitism is concerned, and as far as segregation is concerned, and so on and so forth. So the Yid wants to take advantage, and the Yid wants to enjoy the possibilities that the world gives him. So the Rebbe says, it's true, we have new opportunities, but the very basic nature of what separates a Yid from a Goy has not changed. And if a Yid tries to be like a Goy, he will find out sooner or later that the Goy does not accept him. This is a very, very important lesson for us to learn. It's a mighty important lesson for us to learn. And as people grow up, this is something that they have to know and understand and appreciate. That Purim is not a story that happened thousands of years ago. Purim is a story that's happening right now. And what is the story of Purim? That it looks so attractive to try and be like a Goy. Whether trying to be like a Goy is in the way we dress, I'm absolutely talking about tznius. If a Yid tries to be like a Goy in the way he speaks, the modern style of speech, and being very loud and being very in your face, even in a situation where for women it's not considered tzanua, and so forth and so on. The Purim story teaches us that it never works. A Yid will never succeed in being like a Goy. The Goy won't let him. The Goy won't let him. And this is the lesson of Purim.